Hello over there again. Welcome back to this next lesson on Spring Boot playlist. If you are interested in Spring Boot and Spring Boot technology for building backend REST APIs, and then I guess this is the right playlist to follow along. And in this particular video, this is the video which is going to explain how to initialize and how to configure the database configurations in your Spring Boot application, so that your application can be able to connect to the database and can be able to manipulate the entities in your database. So without wasting time, let us go straight into our IDE and start explaining the concept and writing the concept in form of code. I don't like a lot of theories. So in the previous class, we basically created a simple application. That was on lesson 5. We created a simple Spring Boot application where we implemented a simple controller with one endpoint, and that endpoint was able to send back the response in form of a string. So in our IDE, this is the application which we created in our previous class. We were able to create a simple application, and this is the one controller class which we created, the hello world controller. And then this is the endpoint, and when you reach out to this endpoint here on /localhost/8080, you are able to get this output here, which is welcome to Code Archive student portal. So this was the simple application which we had built in the previous class. So in this particular lesson, we want to look how we can establish and set up the database configuration so that our application can be able to connect to the database that we have specified. For us to do that, we need to first of all add two dependencies, that is the MySQL database, because we are going to use the MySQL database, and then we also need to add the GPA data dependency so that we can be able to initialize and create the database and create the tables using the entities that we have defined in our code. So for us, we need these two dependency. Let me, so that I don't want to waste the time, I want to copy the dependency from our previous application. So the dependencies that we need to add include the MySQL. So we are going to add this driver for the MySQL driver, and then we also need this dependency for the GPA data dependency. So I've copied that. Let us go to our application, and then we are going to open the pom.xml file, and then we are going to add that particular dependency for MySQL driver. And then also we need to add the dependency for the GPA, this particular dependency here. So we need to copy this dependency, and then we need to also add it into our current pom.xml file. So we need to add it here. My computer is hanging up a little bit. So after adding these two dependencies, we need to reload our Maven so that we can have the new changes added to our dependency, added to our application, I mean. And then after the dependencies have been resolved, so we have this dependency in place. So the next thing we need to do is to go to this application, to this file called the application.properties, and we need to go here and then set up the database properties so that we can tell Spring Boot which database is it going to connect to. So here we are going to add the database configuration properties. We are going to specify spring.data source, and then we are going to specify the data source URL. And then here I'm going to use the same URL. The database URL must start with JDBC, and then the database name. So this is the URL for my database. So I'm going to have to copy this particular URL and then use the same in our current file. So I'm going to copy that URL. What I'm going to change here is that I am going to connect to a different database, and I am going to connect this particular database in my server, in my SQL server, e-learning database. So when you come to my SQL, you can see that I have already created this database, but for now this database is empty, does not have any tables. So I want to connect to this particular database called e-learning, so I need to specify it in this properties file. And because my SQL is running on my local computer on port 3306, and this is the particular database, and I'm telling Spring Boot that create this database if it does not exist. But now Spring Boot is also intelligent, it will not create the database because already the database already exists. But if the database does not exist, then Spring Boot is going to boot up, and then it is going to create this database with this name. And then the next property you need to add is the username and the password for your database. So we are going to add Spring Boot the data source username, and then my username is the root, and then I'm also going to add the Spring password, the database the password for my database, which is Sam at 1996. So that is the password and the username for my database. And then also you need to specify any other properties that you need to add. So we may specify properties like the GPA update, or maybe you want to specify the dialect, or you want to specify whether to show the SQL query, SQL statements or not. So we are going to also add that, and then I'm going to explain. So I'm going to add the GPA specific properties, spring.data GPA.Hibernate. So I'm going to add the dialect for this database. So I'm using this MySQL dialect. So let me just copy this, and then I'm going to add it to our properties here. Then the next property that we need to add is this particular property, GPA.show, and we need to set it to here. This is to tell Spring Boot that you need to show us the SQL statement in the console. When you execute any SQL statement, then you show that SQL statement in the code. And then also you may need to specify the Spring. Maybe you want to the DDL out configuration. Maybe we set this one. It has 4 parameters. So I'm going to set it to update. That means that my Spring Boot should be able to update the current database. If there is any feature I have added, it should be able to update the current database and just add that one feature. So these are all the properties that you need to add. These properties are already enough. The first 3 are the main ones. These ones you can add them if you want, but they are also very important. So that is all the steps you need to add the database configurations. So this particular video is about to tell you how you can establish the database. The first step you need to do is to go to your pom.xml file and ensure that you add these 2 dependencies, the MySQL dependency and also the GPA Spring Starter Data GPA. And then if you are using a different database than MySQL, then you need to make sure that you add the correct driver here. And then after you have added the dependencies here, the next thing now you need to do is to come to the properties and also define these particular properties to specify the URL and the password and the username for your database. And then when you run the Spring Boot application, that Spring Boot application is going to, because Spring Boot has the feature of auto configuration, we said when you add this at Spring Boot application, then there are some default auto configuration feature added. So Spring Boot will use the auto configuration feature, and then it will go to this pom.xml and determine which dependencies have you added. So it will find that you have added the MySQL dependency and you have added the GPA dependency, and the Spring is going to know that you need to connect to your database. And then if it finds this and it finds out that you need to connect to the database, then it will come and pick up this configuration and use these configurations to connect to the database that you have specified here. So that is all you need to set up so that you can be able to connect to your database. So guys, I want to post this particular lesson here, and if you have a question about this lesson, then you can type it in the comment section so that we can get back to you. In the next section, we will now start creating our first data class so that we can be able to connect to this database and then create the tables in our database and add some data to our database. And then we will also demonstrate in the next video how we can configure the same properties using another file format called the .yml file, which is another better format of specifying the application properties than using the application.properties file. So in the next, we are going to use another file format called I'm going to use to create a new file, and then we are going to use this file format, which is called application.yml file. So there are two. You can either configure the application properties using this properties file, or you can use this format. So in the next video, we will look how to use .yml file. Otherwise, thanks for watching this content, and if you find it useful, please consider subscribing and also sharing the same content with your friend who might also benefit. Otherwise, see you in the next video.